in which the listener is asked to remember the Panama Papers scandal, May 2016. Perhaps we have all become too cynical. Why should we be suspicious of people who hide money deep within multiple shell companies on a tax haven island with the transparency of a lead-lined coffin? It's like being suspicious of your husband just because he's hidden a second mobile phone in a box of Maltesers in his gym bag, wrapped in an old dust sheet, in the car, in the space where the spare wheel should be. This scandal suggests some complex element in the British psyche that knows this kind of thing is happening but can't bear to be confronted with the knowledge. We know Cameron is filthy rich, he's wearing a 10 grand suit, but his sin is that he has forced us to think about it. Cameron has struggled to deal with the revelations, partly because he has no idea what normal is. I mean, none of us are certain really, but let's not forget that Dave once did a photo op where he tried to eat a hot dog with a knife and fork. The phrase, something like £30,000, is a phrase the man in the street can only tolerate being used so casually if it's describing the weekly wage of some journeyman left-back sex case that his club is after. One thing we've learned is that rich people aren't even rational. They can afford to live in the Cayman Islands and leave their money here. Instead, they make their money go on holiday so they can live in perpetual rain, like the way the dwarves in the Snow White movie kept all the diamonds and lived in the forest. Of course, there will be many in his parliamentary party who would be glad for Cameron to go, but not like this. If he goes because benefiting in some way from offshore funds is unacceptable, then literally none of them can replace him, and the party will have to be led by a picture of a bulldog for a while. A standard rhetorical pose on the left is that austerity is not economic but ideological. Is it an ideology? Isn't that giving a bit too much credibility to a philosophy that amounts to, I think we should take everybody else's stuff? Describing austerity as an ideology suggests that people like Osborne and Boris have a misguided faith in free market principles that is simply too pure for this cruel world, when they're actually 2 drinks away from burgling a charity box in a pub. I'll admit I watched Ian Duncan Smith on Andrew Marr after he resigned, and for the briefest moment thought I could see a certain passion, albeit misguided. I suppose I had a glimpse of how he and his supporters see him, as an almost heroic figure. But if a serial killer sees himself as being sent to rid the streets of prostitutes, we don't sit there and say, yes, I suppose he is a cleansing flame wielded by the Almighty, if you look at it from his point of view. Work assessments for people with Parkinson's and cerebral palsy isn't a different take on morality, it's immorality, and it doesn't particularly matter what the rationalisation is. I sometimes wonder if austerity might be less of an ideology and more of a pathology. One of the reasons the Panama scandal is so damaging is that conservatism has positioned itself as moralist. There's a lot of talk about what's right and fair. In practice, this rightness and fairness is only seen as being something deserved by hard-working families who speak English. So there's an implicit rejection of the foundation of morality, universality. When you look at it like that, conservatives raging against human rights is actually completely consistent. They don't believe that everybody deserves what's right and fair, just those who conform to their idea of normal. And let's not forget, they have their ideas of normal forged in the public school system, a bloody crucible of hierarchical sodomy. Of course, they totally fuck over hard-working families who speak English as well, because once you've abandoned the key principle of morality, you've actually adopted a mindset quite close to that of a sociopath. I mean, we think of them as jolly millionaire malvivants, but they're much more dreadful than that. I'm ashamed to say that, at my worst, I think maybe hard-working, English-speaking families who voted for Cameron deserve what they get, because they chose to believe a serial killer when he told them that they were his favourite. In the old days, courtiers aped the style of the monarch. Modern politicians aspire to be like today's rulers, our corporate overlords. If you spend a sizable chunk of your career making sure corporations can take their money offshore, and hope to work for those companies later in your career with some title like non-executive director of thanks for all the favours, and if corporations actively court political influence through massive lobbying operations, then you'll end up with a certain level of symbiosis. Also, let's not forget that the lobbyist's job is to mimic politicians, and the politicians are trying to promote themselves and their agendas to business. It's like Mad Men if there were no creatives and everybody was just in sales. Imagine the horrifying occasions where they bond: drunken lunches, awards ceremonies, a black mass in the Cotswolds. In the end, as a senior politician, having spent a career in what is the PR wing of corporatism, offshore tax arrangements might well be one of the few things you know anything about. I mean that quite literally. Politics will be full of people who wouldn't know the price of a pint of milk but will understand the incorporation of a shell company. Why wouldn't they have a trust in Panama? Corporations may hire celebrity spokesmodels, personify themselves as mascots, and in the US demand that they have the constitutional rights of people, but they are not people. They are blueprints for making money, and they don't address their social obligations because they don't care. I suspect before long we'll see corporations donating to space exploration in the hope that they'll be able to take advantage of a 0% tax rate by screwing their company headquarters plaques to the surface of the moon. In a decade it'll be covered with so much tessellating brass it'll shimmer like a distant glitter ball through the gaps in the roofs of their employees' shacks. I should perhaps come clean and tell you that the worst holiday I've ever had was in the British Virgin Islands. There's so much money sloshing around that I saw seabirds stranded on the shores, collected by volunteers and taken to wildlife shelters, where skilled vets carefully removed the wads of cash clogging up their feathers. I saw a heron have enough rubles pulled from its wings to buy a decent family hatchback. I remember a pelican, its bill pouch stuffed to bursting, crumpled euros and untraceable yen spilling from its mouth like a stripper's thong. In a restaurant, for dessert, I was served a battered suitcase brimming over with 200 million euros worth of bearer shares. When I told the waiter that I'd ordered the creme brulee, he gave me a dry chuckle and said that he must have misheard. He let me keep the suitcase, saying that there was plenty more where that came from. At night, we gathered on a starlit veranda to watch the arrival of the cash. It's one of nature's most epic sights. First we heard the grunting, faint at first but then louder, until by just the accent alone we could almost tell the Russian from the Australian from the French. The sea began to foam, the frenzied activity just offshore. And then they landed, huge creatures, some as massive as an alpha walrus. Fat and breathing heavily, they heaved themselves onto the shore. Hundreds, if not thousands. Lawyers, drug lords, politicians, prime ministers, mafia members, businessmen, peers of the realm, sex offenders, and a cellist. Their bodies warm and fleshy. It had been a good summer. This mass of quivering corporate meat quickly made its way towards the dunes, dragging themselves forward, thinking only of themselves. Smaller, weaker animals were crushed, suffocated. Then, in a hysterical free-for-all using hand, feet, snouts, they dig. Each of these secretive creatures digs its own filthy hole, and then, lumbering into position, lower their vent into the crater. It's then that they begin laying, firing into the golden sand wads of unmarked bills, fake invoices, untraceable companies, gold bullion. It takes but a moment, the animals moving quickly so as not to be exposed on the shore for any longer than necessary. Then, with feverish activity from their hindquarters, the hole is backfilled. Without so much as a fingerprint left in the sand, they shuffle, belly first, back towards the sea. They raise their heads to the moon and roar. It is a primeval sound, and one by one they all join in. Soon the waves crashing onto the beach are drowned out by the beasts. There is a final sight of them before they're drawn back into the black tide, anonymous and free. This is something that will happen forever, which scientists now estimate might be as little as 30 or 40 years.